All right, let's get into it. Okay, here we go again. Welcome back, everyone, to the XFL Extract. I'm your host, Gabe, and we got a good one here for you today. We get the first preview of Week 1 of XFL 2023 season. We got a good one here for you. So basically, how I'm going to kind of format this episode is, so every week I'm going to try to do the preview of the week, and then also after the weekend, we're going to do a review of the past weekend. But since this is the first week of the preview, we're going to do things a little bit different here. In future episodes, when we preview the next week, we'll obviously have game footage to look at, and kind of teams will kind of know who's good, who's not as good. But we don't really know much right now. We know the coaches and the players, but we don't know how everything's going to gel together and work. So this episode, I'm going to talk about the games this week. Obviously, there are 4 games this week. There are going to be 4 games every week until we get to the playoffs. And I'm going to talk about the coaches and some notable players that I wrote down. And most of these players are just players that had played in the NFL that are now making a return in a way to football in the XFL, try to get back on track, get their careers back on track, or kind of to start up their NFL career. You know, they were a decent draft pick and didn't quite work out, or they were a later round draft pick that had a little bit of buzz to them, but like I said, didn't work out. So we got a good one here for you, and let's just jump right into it. We got the very first game of the weekend is going to be the Vegas Vipers versus the Arlington Renegades. And so first we'll talk about Vegas. Vegas is honestly one of the most fascinating teams. It's a great one to start off with. So first of all, their head coach. I'll also be talking about the head coaches for all the teams if I hadn't said that already. But the head coach is Rod Woodson, who is a Hall of Famer. He's in the 2009 Hall of Fame draft class. He had a 17-year career where he spent most of his time in Pittsburgh, had 71 career interceptions, and he also won Super Bowl 35 with the Ravens in 2001. Like I said, he was mostly known for his time with the Steelers, as he was there between 87 and 96. Won it with the Ravens, you know, you can kind of say that. I mean, obviously it's a ring's a ring, you know, nothing wrong about that, but a very interesting, just a big name in the XFL, and we'll see there's a couple other coaches that have some decent resumes. We'll see the Seattle coach is a former coach of the year, coach before Sean Payton. We got Hines Ward as a coach too. So these coaches in the XFL, they aren't slouches by any means. These are players or former coaches that have good resumes under their belts. These aren't like random guys that they just pulled up from the high school level. These are actual established people in the football world. So Rod Woodson, probably the most decorated resume out of all the coaches, realistically, especially as a player. I mean, like I said, it's really him and Hines Ward. There's, I think, at least one other coach that was a former player. He doesn't have a great resume, but, you know, that doesn't always matter when it comes to coaching. We've seen Kellen Moore in the NFL. He's now the offensive coordinator for the Chargers, but never really had an NFL playing career. Doing pretty good as an offensive coordinator. Now, I know he got fired from Dallas. I think he has more of a scapegoat type situation, but that doesn't really matter. Talking about the XFL. So, the Vegas Vipers, who were also, just to give a little background on the Vegas Vipers, back in 2020, they were the Tampa Bay Vipers. So, I didn't really know how to go about this because there is the Tampa Bay Vipers, and now there is the Orlando Guardians. So, I didn't know how to say if the Vipers were the Vipers or the area, because Tampa Bay and Orlando are pretty close to each other, but we're going to go with the old Tampa Bay Vipers are the Vegas Vipers now. And so I want to talk about the notable players in this team that they have here. Okay, so the starting quarterback is Brett Hundley, who some of you might know that name. He was on the Packers for a while. That's where he got a lot of his playing time. And he was a 5th round pick back in 2015 for Green Bay. And in 2017, he had 9 starts, and he played in 11 games that year. Threw 9 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, 1,902 yards with a 59.1% completion percentage. So nothing great in terms of numbers, but still, a lot of playing experience. We don't see that with these XFL quarterbacks. It's kind of like half and half. Some of them have some decent playing time in the NFL. some not others. I think Brett Hundley, has the most playing experience that we'll see out of the starting quarterback. So really fascinating to see how they use him. He also has a running threat with him. He was kind of a dual threat quarterback. That's kind of how he made a name for himself in a way, because he does have a decent amount of rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. So I think he's one of the more fascinating quarterbacks because, he was a premier backup quarterback in the league. And I'm kind of surprised he is going down to the XFL because he could honestly get a backup quarterback job in the NFL today because of his time in Green Bay and his starts that he has under his belt. If you have a few starts in the NFL and you look decent enough, then you'll get a backup quarterback job. But just very interesting to see what he can do, kind of maybe, and I think this is great for him because I think it's going to be an opportunity for him to prove himself. So I think it'll be great for him to go out there, prove himself. Maybe he can be one of the better quarterbacks in the XFL, get that backup quarterback job, or maybe even go and get a job where he can compete to be a starter. So going to be very interesting to see what Brett Hundley can do. And then another fascinating player, they have four of the bigger names in the XFL, because the next one is Vic Beasley, who, if you guys were watching the NFL back in 2016, you guys probably know who Vic Beasley is, because he was a first-team All-Pro defensive end, edge rusher, whatever you want to call him, for the Falcons, and he actually led the NFL with both in sacks and forced fumbles. He had 15.5 sacks and 6 forced fumbles. And, 15.5 sacks is kind of a low number for leading the league, but still, nonetheless, led the league. He has 37.5 career sacks, so most of his career sacks coming from that one season. But this is a guy who's a former top 10 pick for the Atlanta Falcons and had at least 1 year successful year. Kind of fell off after that, but he was a vital piece in that Falcons Super Bowl run. And so we'll see if he can turn his career around here and really, maybe he can lead the league, lead the XFL in sacks this year. I mean, he's one of the better pass rushers. When I looked at all the teams, I don't think I picked out any of their pass rushers. Most of the players that I recognize and really were former NFL talents are receivers, as we'll see with the next two players here. But Vic Beasley, a defensive player who could really come on strong here. He was a very athletic defensive end, used a lot of burst and speed to get to the quarterback. So can we see him take advantage of that against these lower level offensive linemen? Clearly he played against a lot better talent in the NFL. And so we'll see if he can take advantage of these lower level guys, get sacks more often, and we'll see. Or maybe not. Or maybe he'll, he fell off in the NFL, maybe he'll also not do so great in the XFL here. And so the next player I want to highlight, still sticking with the Vegas Vipers, is Martavis Bryant. Another big name that people might recognize. He was with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He was a 4th-round pick back in 2014. He has 145 career receptions along with 2,183 yards and 17 touchdowns. So a lot of touchdown catches in there. And he was kind of a partner in crime with Antonio Brown. So it was Bryant and Brown, the two main receivers for Pittsburgh for a year or two back in the day. And a player that kind of I believe he got some suspensions with weed involved in there, so kind of got suspended, and then once you get suspended a little bit, it's kind of hard to make a comeback from that. We'll see another player who got a lot of suspensions and was able to make some decent comeback from that, but Martavis Bryant kind of got derailed a little bit, but this is an extremely talented receiver. We saw that in Pittsburgh. Now, he was playing with Antonio Brown, so obviously we've seen with someone like Juju Smith-Schuster that playing with Antonio Brown can definitely help you out a lot, or just any elite wide receiving talent can really help out the number 2, and then when they go and try to be number 1, it doesn't quite work out. But Martavis Bryant, a lot of talent. I believe he's 6'3", again, blazing fast speed, so he can beat these corners deep, and we'll probably see that here and there, especially with Brett Hundley. We'll see if he can hit the deep ball with Martavis Bryant a couple times, and another player actually here too, I'll bring up, Geronimo Allison, can also be a deep threat for them. Another player that's tall and fast. He was undrafted in 2016, played with the Green Bay Packers. He's one of those famous Packers that's just tall and fast, but not much else with that, not great hands that we've seen in the NFL. But he did reel in 89 catches, 1,045 yards, and 6 touchdowns in his time in the NFL. So not bad stats obviously great for being undrafted. And he could probably still make an NFL roster at this point. He's not very old, and so he could realistically go do that, but I think he wants to see if he can go to the XFL, be a big name, and then be kind of taken seriously, because last time we've seen him, he was low on the depth chart, and so I think he wants to prove to people like, hey, I can be a real NFL receiver. Like, I'll show you in the XFL. I'll go out here. I'll dominate. And I can come in, be a number 2 for an NFL team or number 3, and really, establish himself as a receiver. So, like I said, honestly, the Vegas Vipers, these 4 players are 4 incredibly interesting quartet, if you will, of just NFL players on an XFL team. We'll see a little bit later. There's a few teams here and there that don't quite have former NFL talent on their teams, but Vegas has a great pool of NFL talents. And so I think having them lead off the weekend, playing Arlington, I think is going to be great for the XFL. And so transitioning onto that, let's talk about what Arlington has as far as the roster and the coach. So their coach is Bob Stoops. He was a University of Oklahoma coach from 1999 to 2016, so a long career there at Oklahoma. He won a championship in 2000, and he was also the Dallas Renegades coach back in 2020, so staying pretty much the same team. It's Arlington now instead of Dallas. They aren't at AT&T Stadium, which is interesting enough because AT&T Stadium is in Arlington. They're at Chachta Stadium, Chachta, however you say that stadium. But yeah, coach for the Renegades back in 2020. He finished that half season with a 2-3 record. So we'll see if he can kind of make a name for himself, kind of reemerge, and maybe finish with a better record this year. But I'm actually going to highlight Marquette King first for the Arlington Renegades. And Marquette King is a punter, but he was a second-team All-Pro punter for the Oakland Raiders back in 2016. That's when he was All-Pro. And also back in 2014, he led the NFL in punting yards. So, I mean, leading the league in punting yards does have a lot to do with the offense. And if the offense can't move, then you're going to be punting the ball a lot, but still has a booming leg and just kind of didn't work out in the NFL. I think there might be a little bit of storyline there with why he isn't in the league anymore, but a very talented punter. And we'll see, maybe he can go and throw the ball or run up the middle on a fake punt. So a lot of athleticism for a punter. And so I'm just very interested to see how he can do, as he was a very efficient punter back when he played. And so their starting quarterback is Kevin Anderson. Don't really know too much about him. He has no NFL experience, but they also have Kyle Sloter on their roster. And when I say who's a starting quarterback and who's not, I'm just going off of the images that they put out on the XFL Instagram page. They released all the 51-man rosters, and I just went with the top guy on there. But we'll see. I'm not exactly sure who's going to start. I'm just assuming that this is the roster and the depth chart all in one. So we'll see. Kevin Anderson is at the top of the 3 quarterbacks there, but they also have Kyle Sloter, who started in a preseason game for the Bears in 2017. And he played pretty decently, but still got waived and kind of went from practice squad to practice squad, bounced around to a lot of different practice squads, but just was never able to establish himself on any team. But he did look good when he got out there in the preseason. Now, it is the preseason, so it is lesser talent, but, a lot of the preseason guys are going to be similar talent to maybe that we'll see in the XFL, maybe even a little bit more talented than we'll see in the XFL. So I think it's just interesting to watch out for him. Kevin Anderson, like I said, has no NFL experience, so if he doesn't work out, you have Kyle Sloter you can go to. And so it's just going to be kind of interesting to see, because I think some teams have more quarterback security with who they have as their number 1 guy. Like I said, Brett Hundley is most likely going to start the whole season. I can't imagine anyone on that Vegas team taking him up, but it's very possible that Kyle Sloter could go above Kevin Anderson. And if Kevin Anderson doesn't play very well, they can put in Kyle Sloter, knowing that he has some decent experience, and they can see what they can get out of him. And another interesting player that I want to mention is Will Hill. So Will Hill is a safety. Will Hill's a safety. He played for the Ravens, and most people, if you remember, the Ravens were playing the Browns back in week 7 of 2015. And he returned the game-winning. So the Browns were lining up to get a field goal to win. It was a tie game. Browns were trying to get a field goal to win the game. It ends up getting blocked, and Will Hill picks it up and runs it back for a touchdown as time expires. It's a very famous play because it's a very Browns play to have happen because I was back in the middle of the Browns just not doing very well and just being the Browns. They were kind of, not laughing stock in the NFL. I know that's a little mean, but, they were never taken all that seriously and they just had bad luck, just like this. End of the game, you're trying to win and it ends up getting blocked, returned, touchdown. And something else I want to note, he has 4 career NFL interceptions, but he did actually manage to pick off Drew Brees. So one of those 4 career interceptions was on Drew Brees. So I don't know, that doesn't mean nothing because Drew Brees is a great quarterback, future Hall of Famer, takes care of the ball really well. And also, funny enough, his teammate Cre'Von LeBlanc also picked off Drew Brees in the playoffs back in 2018. So I just want to highlight Cre'Von LeBlanc as well because he had some decent playing time with the Eagles when they were making that playoff run in 2018. They ultimately fell short in that game against the Saints. But I think it was the first play of the game. Drew Brees threw it up and he was able to come down with it. So, someone else with some NFL experience played in that Eagles secondary. And so just someone else to keep an eye on for. So the Arlington Renegades could have a decent secondary with Will Hill and Cre'Von LeBlanc. So just keep an eye out for that. Honestly, it'll be an interesting matchup to see these corners go up against the receivers that they have on Vegas. So just a key matchup to keep an eye on for. I do think Vegas will ultimately end up with the win because they have the better quarterback. Maybe, I want to say the better coach, but maybe not, just because Bob Stoops has more actual coaching experience. It'll be interesting to see. I think that's another interesting thing to look out for. The coaches who were actually coaches before versus the coaches who were just former players. And so how that really has an impact on these players. And so, like I said, I think Rod Woodson and the Vegas Vipers end up getting the win for the first game this weekend. But I think it's going to be interesting with that matchup of the receivers and that secondary. So the next game that we have is going to be the Orlando Guardians versus the Houston Roughnecks. And like I said, Orlando Guardians used to be the New York Guardians, but they are now Orlando. And like I said, this one's kind of a mismatch of Tampa Bay Vipers and Orlando Guardians because, Tampa Bay and Orlando are pretty close, but it's Guardians versus Guardians. So something else I want to mention that I really like about the XFL, kind of a random thing, is I love how it's half of the XFL teams have NFL team counterparts and the other half doesn't. So this is one of those teams that doesn't have an NFL counterpart. So the teams that do, we have Houston, Vegas, Seattle, and DC have NFL counterparts, and then there's Arlington, Orlando, St. Louis, and San Antonio. You can make the argument that Arlington and Dallas are basically the same because the Cowboys play in Arlington, but it's still a new fan base. And also something else I want to point out too, another thing real quick, is that there are the divisions, and there's the North and South Division, and the South Division just pretty much has all of the Texas teams because there's 3 teams based out of Texas, and I think they did that because the XFL home base, I believe, is, I want to say it's in Houston, but it could be, I think it's either Houston or San Antonio. I want to say Houston, but it could be San Antonio. I'm blanking at the moment right now, but Arlington, Houston, San Antonio, and Orlando are all in the South Division, while Vegas, St. Louis, Seattle, and DC are all in the North Division. So I just want to point that out. It's going to be an interesting rivalry to see all the Texas teams really go at it with each other. And so I believe, looking at the schedule, never mind. So yeah, this is one of the divisional matchups with Orlando and Houston. So their head coach is Terrell Buckley, Terrell Buckley, who was the 5th overall pick in 1992 by the Green Bay Packers. He was had a 14-year career as a defensive back in the NFL. He won Super Bowl 36 with the New England Patriots, and then he kind of bounced around between 1992 and 2005, kind of bounced around with a few different teams, never really stuck anywhere permanently all that long, but still won a Super Bowl, just like Rod Woodson. And so, like I said, another one of these teams were coached by a former player. And so their starting quarterback is Quinton Dormandy, who doesn't have any NFL experience. He was the Central Michigan starting quarterback in 2019. He went undrafted. Hasn't really done much, but as of right now, it looks like he's the number one on the depth chart. But another player I want to really highlight is Paxton Lynch. A lot of you might know the name Paxton Lynch. He was the 26th overall pick in 2016. I believe he was the third quarterback taken because it was Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, 1 and 2, and then later down Paxton Lynch. And he only has 4 NFL starts. He threw 4 touchdowns, 4 interceptions with a 61.7 completion percentage and 792 yards. Also, if I have mentioned, he played for the Denver Broncos, drafted by the Broncos, and only got 4 starts there before he ended up getting cut and now pretty much run out of the league. No one really signed him. Some people signed him, but don't really give him a chance as a starter. And so I think he has a lot to prove because he was this player that was a first-round pick. A lot of hype for him. I believe he's 6'7", big arm. So a lot of physical traits that he has, but ultimately just didn't work out in the NFL for one way or another. I believe it just, the mental aspect wasn't the most accurate quarterback. So I think it's going to be interesting to watch out for Paxton Lynch to see if he can take that job for Quinton Dormandy and see what he can do because, like I said, very talented player. Can he establish himself in the XFL and keep a starting quarterback job and maybe potentially, like I said, make that leap to the NFL again, compete with one of these teams that have quarterback needs, or maybe he can just make a name for himself in the XFL and stay in the XFL. I think that's another interesting note with all these players to look out for is look out if these players jump out at you, and throughout the season too, I'll also, when I do these previews and reviews of the games, I'll also make sure to point out these new players that I see that jump out to me. These are just players that have, it's either going to be the starting quarterback or they have NFL experience or just, like I said, a first or second round picks, a decent draft pedigree, like Paxton Lynch. Not much NFL experience, but good draft pedigree being a first round pick. So it's just going to be interesting to see what he does. Can he come out here, play well, and establish himself either as a long-time XFL quarterback or he can make that jump to the NFL. So as I was trying to say to wrap that up, keep a lookout for which players are going to break out and potentially stay in the XFL and maybe wait a year or two before they go to the NFL, get more playing time, or they immediately make that jump to the NFL, try to make an NFL roster, and make an impression. So the next player for the Orlando Guardians I want to bring up is Cody Latimer, who is a second-round pick by the Broncos in 2014. So, the Broncos not having the best of draft luck here, we've seen with Paxton Lynch and Cody Latimer. But he did put up some decent numbers in the NFL, actually reeled in 70 catches for 935 yards and 6 touchdowns in his NFL career. But obviously didn't quite work out in the NFL, bounced around a little bit, but never stuck anywhere after Denver. So we'll see if he can kind of come out here and reemerge himself as well. We also see another receiver that has some decent NFL experience is Eli Rogers, another one of these Pittsburgh Steelers receivers that we've seen here. He was undrafted back in 2015, and he played with the Steelers between 2015 and 2018, and he ended up catching 78 catches for 822 yards and 4 touchdowns with the Steelers. He was always kind of a number 3, number 4 guy for them there, but still a very solid receiver, reliable receiver whenever they went to him. So I'm kind of surprised he ended up finding himself in the XFL. I kind of thought he might be a team's 4th or 5th receiver at this point. He probably can be, honestly, but like I said, he probably wants to go out there and make a name for himself. And so just be interesting to watch this duo of Cody Latimer and Eli Rogers, maybe catching passes from Paxton Lynch. And we'll see if that trio can really be explosive for Orlando. And now defensive player, we're going to talk about Matt Elam, who was the 32nd overall pick by the Ravens back in 2013. So another first-round pick that we're seeing on the Orlando Guardians. But he didn't really work out. He had a promising start to his career. He ended up starting 15 games as a rookie, and he acquired 77 tackles, 3 passes defensed with 1 interception. But ultimately, injuries kind of led to him declining. Couldn't really get back on track after he was injured a little bit. So we'll see if he can reemerge and show that promise that he had as a rookie in the XFL here. And so just another player in the secondary to look out for. And then lastly, on the Orlando Guardians, actually bringing up another punter. I swear this is the last punter that we'll bring up is Johnny Townsend, who is another Raiders punter, 5th round pick by the Raiders. And had a decent start to his career. He's actually brother to Tommy Townsend of the Kansas City Chiefs. So just another player to look out for that had some decent NFL success, and just someone to really keep an eye on to see, if this offense consisting of potentially Paxton Lynch or Quentin Dormandy, Cody Lambert, Eli Rogers, if it doesn't quite work out, hey, maybe you got a good punter in your hands that can pin the opposition, get you a good field position for your defense that maybe Matt Elam can do something with. And so we'll kind of see how that works out. And then the other opposition, so it's going to be Orlando versus Houston now, the Houston Roughnecks. So another one of these XFL teams that have an NFL counterpart. Their head coach is actually Wade Phillips, which a lot of you might know. He's a very infamous head coach, honestly, with his play style and just the way he his personality. He's actually been a head coach 3 different times with the Broncos, Bills, and Cowboys. He was with the Broncos back in 93, 94, Bills 98 to 2000, and then the Cowboys from 07 to 2010. So he's been in the head coaching game for a long time, 30 years. And in his 9 seasons as an NFL head coach, he went 89-63. So he does have a winning record. And he's also been a defensive coordinator 9 different times. So he really has a lot of experience under his belt. He is known for his defense, obviously being a defensive coordinator, and he's a very aggressive defensive player. Kind of has some controversy with the way he targets players potentially. So a little bit of scandal there, but still a lot of pedigree. Probably the most decorated head coach that we've seen as far as coaching pedigree, that is. So we'll see what he can do for Houston and that defense. And so the Houston, I want to bring up the 3 quarterbacks because they do have 3 quarterbacks that interest me. The starting quarterback is Caleb Ellaby, and he was undrafted in 2022, so he's incredibly young, and he played at Western Michigan. Like I said, undrafted, tried to make an NFL roster, couldn't quite do it, but he ended up coming into Houston and is now the starting quarterback. But they also, I want to bring up, they have Cole McDonald, who is a 7th round pick back in 2020 out of Hawaii to the Titans, and like I said, also couldn't make the final cut, but a very tall, athletic quarterback that played in Hawaii. And so we'll see if maybe he can take the starting job if Caleb Ellaby doesn't quite do as well. And then lastly, they also have Brandon Silvers, who was a starter for the Seattle Sea Dragons back in 2020 when the XFL had its little half run. So just another person, doesn't have any NFL experience, but does have former XFL experience. So I just kind of want to bring that up. Mostly because I don't know what the quarterback situation is going to be. I don't know how great Caleb Ellaby is going to be. He could be fantastic, could start the whole season, but I just think it's kind of interesting to look at the quarterbacks specifically and kind of see which teams are going to have the established quarterbacks and which teams might end up rotating some quarterbacks in. And I think the Houston Roughnecks could potentially be one of those teams. We saw back when they played in 2020, Houston, they had the best quarterback, PJ Walker, who is now on the Carolina Panthers. He would have been the MVP of the XFL had it finished out. So might be a different story for Houston this time, but who knows? Maybe Caleb Ellaby will come out here and play just as well as PJ Walker did back then. And then the only other noteworthy player on Houston that I want to bring up is Deontay Burnett, who was undrafted in 2018 out of USC. And he did end up snagging 15 catches for 210 yards in the NFL, played a little bit with the Jets and the Eagles, actually played with his college quarterback Sam Darnold with the Jets back in 2018, but he came out really young. I believe he was only 20 years old when he came out, but wasn't able to establish himself, but still, caught 15 passes. So just another player to look out for on that offense to see if he can be one of the better receivers in the XFL. And in this matchup, ultimately, just based off of the players, I'm going to go with Orlando on this prediction here, just because they have a better quarterback situation, potentially. If, I guess we'll see. I guess both these quarterbacks are a little bit of an unknown, so this will be a really interesting quarterback matchup, as we haven't really seen much of these two guys at a professional level. And so, but I do think that ultimately Orlando is going to be able to edge out Houston, as they just have other better players. They have 2 receivers who have some good NFL experience. And yeah, just overall, I think a better roster. And like I said, it'll be an interesting matchup between a former player in Terrell Buckley versus Wade Phillips, the head coaching. So, like I said, another thing to look out for with these coaching matchups. So, got Orlando in this one, just with the player personnel. And so that's going to be the evening game on Saturday. All right, up next we have the St. Louis Battlehawks versus the San Antonio Brahmas. And so the head coach of the St. Louis Hawks he's Anthony Beck. He is a former New York Jets. He was the 27th overall pick in 2000 for the Jets, and he bounced around the league until 2011. Never really established himself all that well as an NFL player, but still former first-round pick, coaching for the Battlehawks here in St. Louis. And their starting quarterback is A.J. McCarron, another name that people might know as far as quarterbacks go. He was a fifth-round pick out of Alabama back in 2014, and he ended up starting 4 games for the Cincinnati Bengals. Ultimately played in 17 games. Had a playoff start in there. I believe it was versus the Steelers. And in his time in the NFL, he had 1,173 passing yards, 6 touchdowns to 3 interceptions with a 62.6 completion percentage. And so just another established quarterbacks. I don't really think there's going to be much of a battle here just because, unless A.J. McCarron really falls off a cliff here, but was a decent backup in the NFL. And, even I think back when he was starting, there was some thought if he could maybe take over Andy Dalton's job, but obviously it never happened there in Cincinnati. But get another chance here. Hasn't really been relevant for a few years now, so maybe he can hopefully reestablish himself, come back here, and be one of the top quarterbacks. Like I said, I don't think there's going to be much of a battle, so we're going to go on now to the other notable players on the roster. We have Marcel Aitman and Gary Jennings Jr., both receivers. Marcel Aitman, more established, who was a 7th round pick for the Raiders back in 2018. He ended up catching 20 receptions for 270 yards and a touchdown for the Raiders, and then ended up getting waived. So had a little bit of success, but ultimately not too much. And then Gary Jennings, who was a 4th round pick back in 2019 by the Seattle Seahawks, but didn't really do much. He was actually waived that same year in November, so really just didn't impress in training camp and preseason. Ended up getting cut. Bounced around to a couple practice squads before ultimately getting released and not signing anywhere. So doesn't have any NFL receptions or yards. So which is a name to look out for, as he was a former 4th round pick, still relatively young. So we'll see if A.J. McCarron can get these young receivers working. They are both pretty young, drafted in 2018 and 2019. So Marcel Aitman, a bigger body. Gary Jennings Jr. also has a decent body, but he's more of a burner too. Can maybe win on some deep balls here. So we'll see what A.J. McCarron can do. Doesn't have the biggest arm, but very accurate. Relatively smart with the football. So we'll see what he can do for the St. Louis Battlehawks. So not really much going on there for St. Louis. And so now if we check out San Antonio, they also don't have much going on. So their head coach actually is Hines Ward, who they don't really have much players, but they have Hines Ward as their head coach. So he had a 14-year career in Pittsburgh. He was the MVP of Super Bowl 40, and he ended his career with an even 1,000 receptions for 12,083 yards and 85 touchdowns in his time in Pittsburgh. So a really great NFL career. And so, like I said, just another one of these really decorated NFL players coming in to coach for the XFL. And they only had one real notable player. And so first, their starting quarterback is Jack Cohen, don't really know how to pronounce his name. He was undrafted in 2022, so really young compared to these other players. And he played for Wisconsin and Notre Dame. He was signed with the Colts in the preseason, but was ultimately waived and didn't really get any playing time. So we'll see if he can kind of establish himself. He was number 1 on the depth chart when I recently checked. So who knows? Maybe he will come out here and end up playing well. And the only other notable player I have for the Brahms is Kalen Ballage, who was a 4th round pick in 2018 by the Miami Dolphins. And he ended up rushing for 655 yards, averaging 3.1 a carry, and he did score 7 touchdowns, so was a bit of a red zone threat, so we'll see if they utilize that in San Antonio. But yeah, ultimately, this matchup, not as exciting, but honestly, who knows, this matchup I think will be good to maybe see who will emerge for these two teams because there's not a lot of NFL talent that really produced at the NFL level. I mean, I even brought up Gary Jennings, who never even produced in the NFL. He was just a 4th-round pick. So we'll see what these two teams can come up with and who will stand out for them. I think it's going to be a really interesting battle to kind of see that. We see teams like Vegas and Arlington who have some decent NFL players. We'll see how those matchups work out. But it's going to be interesting for these teams that don't have those decorated NFL players come out here and see what they can do with these players that are maybe more underrated, maybe more unknown. And so ultimately, I'm not sure who to pick here. I'll just go with St. Louis because they have A.J. McCarron, so more established quarterback that has actually a pretty decent NFL experience. So yeah, not much to say about these two teams, honestly. This is just going to be kind of a matchup to watch for future games to really see, and I'll try to talk more in depth on these teams, kind of see who stands out for me in this matchup. So just a really interesting matchup to see who's going to stand out and who's going to play well, who's going to step up to the plate for these teams. Who knows, maybe no one will step up to the plate, and then we'll kind of see what transitions from there. So even though they might not have the players that these other teams have already out the gate, they could have some guys that are under the radar that could end up performing for them. And then lastly, the last game to end out on Saturday or Sunday evening is the Seattle Sea Dragons versus the DC Defenders. So their head coach for the Seattle Sea Dragons is going to be Jim Haslett, who ended up winning Coach of the Year in the year 2000. He coached the Saints from 2000 to 2005. He was actually the head coach before Sean Payton took over. So, and he did win Coach of the Year. So another one of these coaches who has a lot of coaching background. And this is going to be his first real coaching job since then. Kind of bounced around a little bit here and there, but hopefully a time for him to prove himself as a head coach. And so the starting quarterback, some people might know this name is Ben DiNucci. He ended up playing 3 games and started 1 for the Dallas Cowboys. Didn't throw any touchdowns or interceptions, but did have 219 yards with a 53.5 completion percentage. So just a name to look out for because he does have some NFL regular season experience, and he did start 1 game in the regular season for the Cowboys when Dak Prescott was injured. So we'll just kind of see what he can do. Maybe he can come out here and establish himself as an XFL starting quarterback. So we'll see. Just an interesting player as he isn't decorated. He's not like Brett Huntley or A.J. McCarron type, but he's not like Jack Cohen. So he's kind of that middle ground. Played some game, not too much, no touchdowns, no interceptions. So we'll see if he can kind of maybe push the ball down the field more. With no touchdowns and no interceptions, he was likely conservative with the ball. If you look at his highlights, you can see that he hasn't really thrown the ball down the field. So maybe he can throw the ball down the field more because he will be throwing to Josh Gordon, who is the most decorated receiver in the XFL. He's a former second-round pick out of Baylor, and he ended his NFL career so far with 252 receptions for 4,284 yards with 21 interceptions. And he actually led the NFL in 2013 with 1,646 receiving yards. Just an absolutely absurd number there. And I just looked this up, actually. He did that with Brandon Whedon and Jason Campbell throwing him the football. So he ended up getting 1,600 receiving yards with not very great quarterback play. So that in himself is very impressive that he's able to do that. Now, he is famously known for constantly getting suspended for weed, pretty much. He's got multiple seasons where he ended up not playing a single game due to weed suspensions. And it's just crazy because he is so talented, as we've seen. With 600 receiving yards is very hard to get with a elite NFL quarterback, but when you're playing with backups, you're playing with 3 different NFL quarterbacks during the season like he had to, it's just absolutely absurd that he was able to get that wide open. And on a bad Browns team that didn't have much around him, so he was the only real threat, and he still ended up getting all these crazy stats. It's just really impressive, and he's back in Seattle. He played a few games with the Seattle Seahawks with Russell Wilson, actually looked pretty good before. I believe he might have gotten suspended again, actually, so didn't last too long in Seattle, but as a Sea Dragons fan, I'm excited to have him back up in the Pacific Northwest. Gonna be rocking that number 0, so that's just kind of something that I enjoy, as NFL players can't wear the number 0, so I think it's great that the XFL is letting him do that, because I think it looks pretty clean, and so, you never know, maybe you might see me rocking a Josh Gordon jersey, but Another player that I want to bring up is PJ Hall. He is a defensive tackle, and he was actually the 57th overall pick for the Raiders, and he was someone that came out with a lot of pedigree. I think people were kind of surprised he fell to 57 overall. Had a little bit of success, only 2.5 sacks in his NFL career, so he came on a little bit, but then ultimately fell off. I don't know the whole storyline behind him. I think there might have been some off the field issues. I might be thinking of somebody else, but I believe he had some off the field heart concerns. I'm either thinking of him or Maurice Hurst, who's another Raiders defensive lineman. So I hope I'm not mixing them up. But PJ Hall is a very talented player, and so hopefully he can kind of stuff the run up the middle, and also we'll see some pass rush in the middle for him too. So the only interior defensive lineman I'm highlighting between all the teams, but just a very interesting person to keep an eye out for. And someone else that they have in Seattle is Joshua Perkins. Now he's on IR right now, so we might not see him. Not very many tight ends really made an impression on me when I was looking through the rosters, but Joshua Perkins is someone who has 17 receptions for 196 yards and 2 touchdowns in the NFL. So not crazy production, but a little bit of production here and there. I believe he played for the Eagles in his time in the NFL. So just someone, if he can get off of IR, someone to keep an eye out for. He does have some decent athleticism, pretty decent run blocker too. And like I said, another player coming back to Seattle as he played his collegiate football at the University of Washington. And then lastly, I want to bring up another team captain for the Seattle Sea Dragons. It's Ben DiNucci, and Jordan Evans is the other team captain. He was a 6th-round pick back in 2017 for the Bengals. He's an interior linebacker, and he actually ended up his NFL career with 127 tackles, 3.5 sacks, and 2 interceptions. So some decent production there in Cincinnati before they ended up getting Jermaine Pratt and Logan Woodside and really beefing up that defense. But Jordan Evans really just overall solid linebacker, especially for a 6th-round pick. That's pretty good production out of him. So I'm excited to see him, to see if he can kind of command that center of the defense and see what he can do against the DC Defenders, who now we'll preview here. Last team previewing. Their head coach is Reggie Barlow, who was a 4th-round pick by Jacksonville. He was a receiver. He spent 8 seasons with the Jaguars, Raiders, and Buccaneers. So 4th-round pick, but didn't sign an extension with Jacksonville. He ended his NFL career with just 39 receptions, 522 yards, and a touchdown. So kind of the least prestigious, if you will, XFL coach. But hey, that doesn't mean he's no slouch. It's kind of hard to say what was expected of any of these coaches. I mean, we've seen some of these coaches actually coach before, but never at the XFL level. So that's just going to be a completely different ball game with all these rule changes. And so it's going to be interesting to see who stands out between the 8 of them. And so their starting quarterback is Eric Dungey, who was undrafted in 2019 and has no real NFL experience. But they also have Jordan Ta'ame and De'Aaron King on their roster. And so Jordan, he threw to, just something to note, is back when he was at college, he played at Ole Miss, and he was the quarterback for DK Metcalf and AJ Brown. So he has a lot of really good throwing stats in college because he's thrown to 2 future Pro Bowl receivers in the NFL. And then also De'Aaron King, who is a very interesting prospect as he, a lot of people know him as he played at Miami. But when he was a freshman, actually, he played for Houston, and he was actually a receiver there. And he ended his freshman year with 29 receptions for 228 yards and a touchdown. So a very athletic quarterback here that they have in DC. And so I just want to list these 3 quarterbacks because I do think even though Eric Dungey is a starter, there could be some rotation, especially with De'Aaron King to see. I mean, Eric Dungey could still be the starting quarterback, but you could still throw De'Aaron King in there and see if maybe he can get some rushing yards, maybe use him as kind of like a wildcat option, maybe some read option stuff there. So kind of like how the Saints use Taysom Hill in the NFL. So it's just going to be really interesting to see how they use him there. They also have Raquel Armstead, who's a running back, who's a 5th-round pick by the Jags, who's a really good dual threat as a receiver out of the backfield too, as well as a runner. He has 188 career rushing yards in the NFL, but had some decent production there in Jacksonville. So we'll kind of see if maybe he can reemerge himself as a decent running back in the XFL, maybe one of the better end running backs that is going to be in this league. And then lastly, the person I want to note here is Chad Hansen, who was a 4th round pick in 2017 by the Jets. And he ended up catching 26 balls for 330 yards and a touchdown in the NFL. So we'll kind of see if he can reemerge and really prove himself out here. Who knows? I mean, he doesn't have great quarterback play, honestly, just on paper. Well, who knows? Maybe one of these players can prove me wrong otherwise. But we'll kind of see how that goes. And ultimately, I got Seattle winning this game. Now that is, I'll be honest, it's a little bit biased, but I do think with Ben DiNucci throwing to Josh Gordon, I think that's going to be a really hard combination to stop, just because I think Josh Gordon has the potential to be the best receiver in the XFL. If you just look at all these guys on paper, he was the best one to have NFL production. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Josh Gordon can play. I mean, he's still only 31 years old, I believe. So a little bit older, but not too old where he's going to be broken down. And I mean, all that time not playing due to suspensions, he's got a lot less tread on the tires. So it's going to be really interesting to watch Josh Gordon. So that is all I have for you guys today. Previewing the weekend of the XFL action. I hope you guys enjoyed. And like I said, as we go on throughout the season, it's going to be a lot more clear which teams are good and which teams aren't going to be as good, because we'll see, a lot of these players that I mentioned maybe will do really well. Maybe some of these guys won't do as well, even though they do have former NFL experience. And, maybe we saw them got run out of the league because they're not as great as they once were, or as we once thought they were. And we'll see some guys emerge, just like I mentioned earlier, we saw PJ Walker emerge as a quarterback back in 2020 for the XFL. So I really am excited to see which players are going to surprise me. Hopefully everyone surprises me for the good. I hope I don't get any bad surprises here. But yeah, I really think it's going to be a fascinating start to the XFL season. Really craving some football, especially with how that Super Bowl ended. Really hope that the XFL can have better officiating. I don't want to go into that so far, but it's just a really deflating way to end the Super Bowl and just really disappointing for me. I didn't have a dog in that race, really. I didn't really care about Eagles or Chiefs. And stuff that the Chiefs didn't deserve to win, but man, winning in that way, it's just really disappointing. So I really hope that the XFL can kind of be better at officiating just in general, because also not only that too, the NFL, it was just a really frustrating year for penalties. So many roughing the passers and random PIs too. So it's just really frustrating watching NFL sometimes with all these flags. So I really hope that the XFL can just kind of let these guys play. And I think the players are going to want to let themselves play too, because they do want to show what they can do without the refs getting in the way to make that leap to the NFL. And so I think that's going to be really good for the league and can really help draw some people towards the league if there are less flags, because people might be like, okay, this is starting to feel like real football again. Not that the NFL isn't real football, but people are kind of starting to see that trend where it's really starting to feel a lot softer. Like I said, with all these roughing the passers, it's really hard to hit the quarterback. So hopefully the XFL can kind of look at that and really make an improvement on that, and just overall have a better flow to the game with less flags. And so I'm really excited to see how this weekend goes. Like I said, I made some predictions on the games. I have no clue how they're going to turn out, because it's hard to predict as we haven't seen these guys play. So hopefully as the year goes on, we'll start to know a little bit more about these rosters. But yeah, tune in next week. I believe hopefully around Monday or Tuesday, I'll have my reactions to the first week of the XFL. Should be a good one, as like I said, I'll talk about some of these players that stood out to me and the teams that overperformed, underperformed. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will catch you in the next one.